here.
I was in the passenger seat with my dad driving over the reservoir that I passed over almost every single day when he told me something that I couldn't get out of my head. He said, "Did you know that there used to be an entire town underneath the reservoir before it was flooded out?" After that, he said, "Sometimes you can still see the tops of the buildings poking out of the water." The more my mind thought about it, the more questions I had. What exactly had happened to those people? And why hadn't I never heard their stories before? That's when he told me something that really stuck with me. He said, "Did you know that the name of the reservoir, Geist, is actually the same word for ghost in German?" And that's what the people in its town had become, ghosts forever haunting the water. When I looked more into it, I found out that this wasn't an uncommon thing. In fact, there were hundreds of towns all across the United States that had been flooded out just like this one. Today, I want to walk you through my research, starting with the smell sources that inspired me, some background information, and the main issues that I identified with this topic. Finally, I will leave you with some of the conclusions that I gathered from this issue. Now, before I go further, I'd like to clarify a couple things. I will be referring to water management projects. This is inclusive of dams and reservoirs, but I might also say hydroelectric projects, which is basically the same thing. Now, when looking through all the stimulus sources, two had stood out to me. My Mother's House, a story about an African-American woman returning back to her childhood home, only to find a decrepit memory of her past and her family. As well as the Minority Oral Traditions, a story about the long-term struggle between Indigenous voices and stories against colonialism. Both of these pieces had reminded me of what my dad told me. So I combined the themes of marginalized voices, memory, and erasure, as well as my own personal knowledge to create the research question: how does the construction of dams and reservoirs for hydroelectric power negatively affect marginalized communities in the United States? Now, for some background information, the United States has always been a country that is looked up to on a global stage, yet it has had a long history of flooding out communities, especially marginalized ones. For example, during the Great Depression, the Tennessee Valley Authority was created to build dams in the Tennessee Valley. These dams displaced thousands of people, especially black tenant farmers that were concentrated in the area. These farmers received absolutely no compensation for their losses, while their white counterparts had been fairly compensated for all the land that they lost. Native Americans have also been a heavy target of these dams. In total, there has been over 1 million acres of tribal land that has been flooded out for these projects. That is the entire size of Rhode Island, each acre being a home, a community, and a history. Now, throughout my research, I identified three main issues. The first issue that I identified was the loss of history and culture for these displaced people. Heather Randall, a professor at the University of Minnesota, says, "Cemeteries, temples, and archaeological sites may be submerged underwater, destroying cultural heritage, particularly for indigenous groups with long-standing ties to their land." These displaced people lose major cornerstones of their culture and their history. Graves of loved ones in town cemeteries will forever remain submerged and unvisitable. This is a clear negative effect on these communities, the disconnect from their culture. The second issue I identified was the unethicality of the process in which these communities are cleared out. Eminent domain is the legal backing for these projects. It's the idea that the government can seize land for public use in return for compensation to the affected communities. However, this process has been highly criticized as unethical. The U.S. Civil Rights Commission identified that government officials will specifically target low-income or minority communities because they know that they are underrepresented and don't have the resources to fight it. They also know that they can purposefully compensate them less for their losses. This is a clear abuse of government power, and it is not fair to sacrifice these communities just for eminent domain usage. In addition, Professor Emmanuel Mabura, a professor at the Bandura University in Zimbabwe who studies dam displaced communities, said, "Some dam projects inadequately compensate the affected people. This can impoverish the displaced people." Overall, it is clear that this process is highly unethical, and it takes these displaced communities and put them in a situation that is lower than what they were at before. The last issue I identified was that these communities often receive little to no benefit while the region surrounding it do receive some benefit. This is one of the main arguments for the other side, is that these projects bring a lot of benefits to the region as a whole, such as urban areas are greatly benefited, while rural areas where the construction is directly happening are harmed. Benefits may include things like irrigation, or recreation, or even flood protection. However, this does not offset the immense negative impacts that happen to these communities that are displaced. Stanford researcher Dr. Zitao Uwang said that despite the overall positive impact that hydropower dams have on the globe and countries as a whole, communities in the immediate areas surrounding dams often experience worse economic conditions, population relocation, and/or a loss of green spaces due to their construction. It's not fair that these communities have to be sacrificed in order to bring benefits to the whole. If they are to experience the direct effects of the construction and displacement, they should be able to receive some benefits from these dams and reservoirs. So it is highly unethical that this is happening to these people. Lastly, my conclusions on this issue. I believe that it is important to address these problems, and we must know that for future projects, we must be aware of the footprint that we leave behind. These footprints can erase lives, histories, and communities if we're not careful. So future projects should be aware of these consequences and should take place in an ethical way that don't displace communities such as these. Thank you.
Thank you, Stella. My first question's about the research process. Did your research go in a different direction than you originally expected? And if so, can you explain its path?
Well, I had originally looked at dam displaced communities at a global scale. So I looked at all over the world, and specifically low-income countries such as Asia or countries in Asia and South America. But I eventually narrowed it down to the United States because I felt that the United States had a longer history and had more context. So my research had started moving in that direction once I started finding more information about the United States specifically.
Thank you. And what additional questions emerged from your research, and why are these questions important?
Another question that kind of popped up for me while researching is, why haven't these histories of these people had been recorded before? I mean, when I was looking through the research or the history behind the Geist Reservoir and the town of German immigrants underneath it, I found that there wasn't a whole lot that was recorded of these people. And so that was another question that I think I could have really delved into, was why hasn't these stories been recorded, or do we need to do something to better record the history?
Yeah, are there any landmarks or anything that even say?
Not really. I mean, they have like a couple pictures of like the people and things like that, but that was about it. It was kind of weird.
Excellent. Nice job, Stella.